Hi, I'm Sarah Meister. I'm a curator here in the Department of Photography at MoMA, and we are thrilled to be bringing you a live Q&A on MoMA's YouTube channel. We are going to begin here in the collection storage while people get settled. This is where we store a huge percentage of our collection, and we thought it would be fun to pull some photographs to show you a few before we get going with the real Q&A. And while we do that, I'll not only try to answer a few of the questions, not formally, but a little informally, starting with, say, show me a surprise, something that's a little lesser known treasure in the collection. So, we also thought it would be a nice thing to show you how we store the photographs, why we store the photographs, and to share a little bit of our best practices. So, most of the collection are in cabinets like this. It keeps the water off. If the sprinklers go, that would be bad. It keeps them nice and cold, and we keep them in boxes usually whenever we can, unless they're too big. So here's a box that has some works that we acquired a little more than a year ago. We try not to carry the boxes long distances so we don't risk dropping them, because that would be terrible. And then when we open them, these are all archival materials. We try to keep everything sort of neat and calm. We try when we're handling photographs to focus on the photograph and not focus on, say, talking to you all, so we don't damage anything. So this is a box of works by a Brazilian photographer named Gertrudis Altschul. She's one of my current favorites, although I can't say all time because that's just not fair. And the one I thought I would show you is here on the bottom. It's a photograph of a papaya leaf. Pretty awesome. What I love about it is that it looks a little bit like a photogram, almost like you could see through it, like she was squishing it flat onto the paper, except that when you see the stem, you realize that this is actually like a three-dimensional object in front of the camera. So I like this one a lot. This is a little bit of a surprise. It was on view last year if you came to New York in a show that my colleague Star and I organized called Making Space, Women Artists and Post-War Abstraction. But other than that, I'm sure no one had, well, unless you lived in Sao Paulo, you had not seen it before. So this is how we keep them. This is fortunately not too heavy. Some of them get really heavy, and then we have to have a colleague come help us take them down off the shelf. Okay, so this is not the official Q&A, but we thought we'd answer a few questions while we're in here anyway. The first question, unofficially, is from Victoria on Instagram and Danny on YouTube, who both asked basically, what is the temperature in there and why? Or why is the collection storage space so cold? So it's about 50 degrees in here, 40% relative humidity. And yesterday when I was getting ready for this, I asked our conservator, I was like, how do I describe why it's so cold? And her answer was, I was thinking she was going to give me some complicated chemical something. She was like, everything goes more slowly when it's cold. And so if you think of the photographs having active particles in them, the more you slow it down, the longer they live. So this is true for color photographs especially, but also for gelatin silver prints like most of what we'll be looking at today. So it's cold to keep everything lasting as long as possible. And that's also why we use archival materials. I just washed my hands. So if you see me handling a lot of things, I wouldn't do that unless I had just washed my hands. So that's question number one. We have another question that says, and this is from Chris on Instagram, and he writes, what is your collection policy? And Alfred Stieglitz, please. So excellent choice, Alfred. No, Alfred Stieglitz. Excellent choice, Chris. I pulled a few extra, a little bit like a cooking show, because sometimes if you have to take them down, we have to go too far, it takes too long. So I pulled 3 other photographs, including a Stieglitz, just to show while we're here in collection storage getting warmed up. The first one of these, I mean, I'll say, everything I'm showing, I love all these photographs. But this one is pretty great. Now you'll see there's a little bit of a reflective surface on this, and I'll lift it off to make it easier to see. This is called Mylar. It protects the surface of the picture in storage, and we actually attach it with tape at the top, but it's a special low-tack tape. So this is a photograph by Bernice Abbott, and it's called New York at Night. She made it in 1932, right after the Empire State Building opened. And she made it on one of the shortest days of the year, so in sort of mid to late December. And she did that because she wanted the city to be dark, but she wanted everyone to still be in their offices so that all the thousands and thousands of office lights are on. So it's almost like you couldn't make this picture in the summer because it would be light too late, and by the time it was dark, everybody would be gone home for the day, I hope. So this is a terrific one, and I can't remember who, but somebody definitely wanted to see Berenice Abbott. So that's one. And then, you know, again, like I was saying, you just want to handle them carefully, slowly, because of course the worst thing you could ever do to a photograph is damage it. That would just be the worst. The next photograph I wanted to show you, again, thanks to Chris asking for Alfred Stieglitz, is this terrific image of Stieglitz's made. I'm just going to do this because Stieglitz really, although Berenice Abbott was a little more forgiving about the presentation, Stieglitz was very precise. So here's a photograph he made of his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, and her car. And what I love about this one, this is at his house in Lake George. And to me, he's very well known for the group of portraits that he made of Georgia O'Keeffe. But to me, this is sort of a symbol of her independence, how by 1935, she was definitely a mature artist in her own right, had much more of a sense of autonomy. And I think there's something almost sort of wistful about this, thinking of her hopping in the car and maybe going back to New York City. And so even though the photograph is so beautiful and you see the sky reflected on the paint finish, it still makes me think there must have been something about this car that made him feel a little wistful, or makes me feel wistful, at least. So again, the other thing I try not to do is to actually, and this is super easy to do at home, don't talk over your photos, because everybody spits when they talk, and especially if you're standing right over it, you should be careful. Because spit is not a good friend to photographs, as you might imagine. All right, and then the last one I pulled for us to look at today is this huge, beautiful print. Well, kind of gritty. Maybe beautiful is the wrong word. I'm going to leave the Mylar on it because it's too complicated to take this one off. This is by a photographer named Gordon Parks, and it's from a photo story that he did for Life magazine called The Atmosphere of Crime in 1957. It's actually, I learned more recently, a color photograph, but it was super difficult to print in color back in the 1950s. It was very expensive. So even though in the magazine a lot of his photographs are reproduced in color, the print we own that we acquired from Gordon Parks is actually in black and white. And so it's something I think is really interesting to think about, like what makes photographers make the choices they do, and sometimes it can be an incredibly practical thing, like it's way too expensive to make a color photograph in the 50s. So instead you kind of heighten the graphic quality and you make it in black and white. So I also thought it would be fun while we're here to look for one last picture, to look at a recent acquisition. And these are, if we had been here a week ago, I wouldn't be able to show this to you because it would have been a secret because our committee on photography wouldn't have approved it yet. But now it's all approved, so I can show you. So we store a few things framed, and these are the framed ones. But sometimes something's so big it's here only temporarily, like for an acquisitions meeting. Super careful. Now, for those of you at home, this is not part of the photograph. This is just a string to make sure it doesn't fall off. That would be terrible. But this is an incredible photograph by Deanna Lawson that was in her exhibition not that long ago at Sycamore Jenkins. It's really an incredibly powerful and even bordering on scary photograph. And I love also that a new aspect of her work is she has included this sort of image that's affixed to the outside of the plexiglass. So this is a new aspect of her work. She was actually honored last night as one of the honorees at the Gordon Parks Foundation Gala. So that was nice to see her and celebrate her there. And I thought to myself, and we just acquired it. So let's get out of here. It's cold. I'm sure there are enough people. We'll go do a real Q&A in the study center. Thanks for joining me. All right, here we are in collection. Now we're out of collection storage. My hands are cold, my face is cold, but we are going to have fun out here. I have a whole pile of questions to answer. We got so many great ones from the trailer, both on Instagram and on YouTube. We picked some of my favorites, and I'll apologize in advance that we won't get to do everyone's, but we'll really do our best. If you have any other questions, we're also going to try to work in some questions that are submitted live. So there's a little, what do they call it? A little live chat section. And I have some colleagues here who are going to write down your questions and give them to me. And then we'll try to answer those as well. All right, let's get to the questions. Okay, the first one is from Anastasia from YouTube. And she writes, what aspect of the work should we focus on first when we visit a photography exhibition? And I think that's such an excellent question. It's like, what do you think about? You walk in, let's say you don't know the work. What are you going to look at? How are you going to think about it? I like to see an exhibition. At first, I like to just look at the work. So you try to do sort of a sweep through, and you think to yourself, let's look at what this artist is doing. What are they doing in terms of scale? What are they doing in terms of subject matter? Do there seem to be important things about the materiality of what they're doing? And you kind of just get a general feel. If I'm at a gallery or at a museum, then I usually go up and I try to read the wall text. I would recommend not doing that first because it kind of opens up a little bit more what your experience can be if you've had a little time with the art first. And then after that, chances are I'll go back again. And maybe the second time around you pick fewer pictures, but you just dive in a little deeper. When I go with my children, I call it a surgical strike. So with them, I might skip the first and the second parts and just say, okay, we're going to look closely at 3 pictures, and that's it. And you know that can be a really rewarding thing, too, is just sort of slowing down enough to look at just a couple of things. So, but that's an excellent question. Thank you. Carrying on. Okay, Mac J on Instagram wrote, are there specific steps one can take to become a curator of photography? Another good question. I would say yes, there are typical ones, and then there are less typical ones. The typical one might be might be an art history major in college, and then you might try to get some practical work experience. So let's say you go work in a gallery or an auction house or a museum, and you try to sort of get some experience working with real works of art. And then most photography curators go to graduate school. I happen to be an exception to that, but it's particularly this day and age much, much more common. So I would say it's a combination of school, work experience, and then the nice thing is, and the way I feel here at MoMA is like your learning goes on and on. So although I'm not specifically in school anymore, I always try to go see as much art as I can. I try to read a lot. I try to have conversations with my colleagues to try to understand the way they see things. And traveling is also a really wonderful way, if you're able to try to understand how people see things and do things differently in other parts of the world, which can be hard, but that's optimal if you can do that. We okay? All right. So A. Wheedler wrote on Instagram, I love Helen Levitt's work and saw some online at MoMA's website. So guess what? We pulled one. I love Helen Levitt too. The first one we pulled is this, one of Helen Levitt's most famous images. And this photograph came into the collection officially accessioned in 1941, but it was a photograph of Helen Levitt's that she made in 1940 on the streets of New York. So you have to imagine that's a super short time. It's actually not unlike the Dina Lawson, where it's a recent work, and then where it's a recent work and we're just acquiring it. That happens less frequently, I would say, than sometimes a little more time passing. But so Helen Levitt made this photograph in 1940. In December of 1940, we actually exhibited it here at MoMA in the first exhibit of the formal Department of Photography. I forgot to mention that. So we have a Department of Photography, and we have had a Department of Photography ever since December 1940. The museum started in 1929, so the museum was just 11 years old when we established a Department of Photography. And it was a great moment, and the show that they organized was called 60 Photographs, a survey of camera aesthetics. So it was setting forward that photography was an art form with its own set of aesthetic concerns. And this actual print, not just this image, but this actual print was included in that exhibit. And one of the things I love is that now on MoMA's website, you can actually go onto the exhibition history and see images of this picture on the walls at MoMA, which is really cool. So, sorry, to turn to the question, what qualifies an artwork to be on the website as opposed to an exhibition at the museum? Who, and most importantly, what makes that decision or difference? So there's a super practical question really about the website, which is that for us to put something on the website, it has to have an image, and we have to have, we generally try to have permission from the artist or to have it be copyright free. So that's how it gets on the website. To be in an exhibition requires more deliberation, usually, actually almost exclusively on the part of the curators. So the curators say, I really want to put this work on view. I'm going to put it in view in this context. So this one, for instance, when they said I want to pick 60 photographs that represent camera aesthetics for MoMA's public in 1940. So that's how that happens. I'm going to answer a live question now. This one just came in. Okay. This is from Alexander on YouTube. Does MoMA archive a digital copy of all those photographs? Super great question. And the answer is yes, really. Whenever we get a new acquisition, and we also work backwards to make sure we have an image of everything that's old, we make a digital copy we have a great photo studio, and they make an image. It's the sort of digital version of what we used to have do in an analog way, which was we had a copy negative of every work in the collection. And we use those digital copies to make reproductions in books and to share if somebody requests them from us. So yes, we really, really try. Sometimes if it's a work that's super big and super complicated to install, until we install it for the first time, we might ask for an image from a gallery or from an artist, but we really prefer and try to make them all our own. One more from YouTube before I go back to some of the ones that came earlier. Does MoMA, this is from Daphne, also through YouTube. Oh, I guess they're all through YouTube now. Okay, if it's a new one, it's from YouTube. Does MoMA collect Polaroids? And the answer is absolutely yes. Our conservator calls them internal dye diffusion transfer prints because we try to not use brand names. We try to refer to the actual chemical process, but really it's a Polaroid. And actually, our compromise is that we call it an internal dye diffusion transfer print, parentheses, Polaroid. So yes, we do. The reason we didn't pull any of those is that we keep those in a super cold part of the storage, that to take them out of there, you have to let them acclimatize overnight, and we really try to do that only when we really need to. We had plenty of other stuff to show you today. All right. Another one on YouTube. This one's from Nicholas. Is forgery ever an issue? Wow, great question. Is forgery ever an issue in photography the same way it is in painting? Why, yes, it is. There have been some really fascinating forgery stories in the history of photography. And, well, I would say, I don't want to, oh, shame. You know, the thing is, photography is a reproducible medium, so that carries with it a whole host of complications. This is not to say that people can't detect forgeries, and they can, but actually, the thing that has helped photography for most of its history is that photographs were never really worth that much. So if it wasn't worth that much, who would bother to make a forgery? A little bit later, we're going to talk about Dorothea Lange, and when we do, we'll get to the idea of an original and a copy, which is not the same thing as a forgery, but certainly forgery can be an issue. I don't want to out anyone, though, on YouTube. That doesn't seem nice. Okay, one more from the live ones, and then we'll go back to some of the earlier questions. This is from Catherine Ellington. And I hope I'm allowed to say this. Catherine is a mentor in our course online, Coursera, Seeing Through Photographs, which means that she helps sort of lead group discussions and things like that. So thanks, Catherine. So Catherine asks, how do you decide on frames for photographs? That is a really good question. And it was something that it takes a while to learn how to pick the right frame for a photograph. The way I learned how to do it was to spend a lot of time looking, of course, and listening to Peter Perez in our frame shop. He is the foreman of our frame shop, and he is just brilliant. So he helps me think through, would this picture look better in a dark frame or with a light frame, with a walnut frame or a metal frame? And you want a frame that sort of helps you focus on the work. But you may have noticed when we were in storage, we looked at that Dina Lawson picture. She picked a frame that has this gilded front. So sometimes artists pick their own frames, and in that case, we respect that, and we really just try to take care of those frames carefully. But certainly how we decide to frame things, you may not even notice when you come to the museum. In fact, we hope you don't notice the frames when you come to the museum. We want you to look at the photographs. But we do try to make selections about those frames that help you focus on those. If we had all different frames in all different ways, it might be confusing and might not help the art look as good as it can look. Okay, back to some other questions. Oh, this was a tough one, but I decided I wanted to answer it anyway. This is from Bill Gubbins on YouTube, and he wrote, in the 80s, MoMA photo curator John Cherkovsky called Gary Winogrand, quote, the central photographer of his generation. Who do you believe is the central photographer of the current generation? And people ask me this a lot. And I'm not being lazy when I say, I think the world today has reached a point where it doesn't really make sense to think of a central photographer of a generation. There are too many really great artists working in too many different paths to conceive of themselves necessarily as a generation of artists. And so every 2 years we organize a photography show that features a lot of the photographers who we think are important and doing new work. But and certainly if you look at the artists where we do a one-person show, we have a Stephen Shore retrospective right now on view on the 3rd floor. These are certainly central figures of their generations, but we really, I don't know. I don't like to answer that question in the singular. So sorry to answer your question with not an answer, but there you have it. Oh, here's a good one. So this is from Instagram, and Jane Mordini writes, doesn't WPA, and by that I think she is referring to the Works Progress Administration and or the government, doesn't WPA own Dorothea Lange photos? How can you make copies? So this is super interesting. I'm going to put away our Helen Levitt, and I'm going to take out some Dorothea Lange photographs. So the first one is Lange's iconic migrant mother. And yes, Lange made this photograph while working for the US government. She was actually working for the Resettlement Administration in 1935, which became the Farm Security Administration in 1937. But if you just think of it as the alphabet soup of government planning under FDR, she was one of those, and the WPA was also one. So yes, Dorothea Lange was making this made this photograph while working for the government, which means that it has always been, throughout its life, available for anyone to use with no copyright restrictions whatsoever. And in fact, if you go onto the Library of Congress's website today, you can download a file made from this negative and print your own, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's not illegal, it's not a forgery, it's just what it is. Now, I happen to be writing a book about Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, so stay tuned, it'll come out this fall. And there was another question. Yeah, this is from Lou on Instagram, who writes, what is the airbrush technique and how can you recognize it on a picture? So Lou, we thought it would be interesting to pull together not only a classic, very early print of Lange's migrant mother. This is one that came into the collection probably in 1949, so it's not one of the earliest prints, but it's an early print. And I thought it might be interesting to look at this one next to this. So this is a print of Lange's migrant mother that came to us from the New York Times. It has heavy, heavy airbrushing on it. So if you look, for instance, you see, and the way you can tell airbrush is, unlike up here where you can see that the paint has been like painted on, you can kind of see the brush strokes in it. When you have airbrushing, it's a super even look. And when you look at it under a microscope, you can actually see the little dots from the way that the paint is spat onto the surface of the picture. But it really, it makes for a much more dramatic contrast. So when you paint in the dark parts, like the spaces between their fingers, and then you airbrush other parts to make it look smoother, you can see how, if you were reproducing this in a newspaper, let's say, how this photograph would reproduce much more cleanly than this. And since I sort of promised we would do this, and I remember I said I washed my hands, so if our conservator is watching, I promise I did. The other thing that's great about this photograph, if we take it out, is that on the back, now, of course, I'm being so special with this, you understand that before this photograph came to MoMA, thousands of people probably held it with the dirtiest hands you can imagine. It was circulated. Every one of these stamps on the back suggests that, or tells a time when it was reproduced in the New York Times. So the earliest one that I found is here, July 26, 1936, and that is the earliest, but it actually was reproduced up through 1976. That's the most recent stamp. So this is a photograph that, even though now that it's here at MoMA, we treat it super precious and we take very good care of it. It lived a long, very active life in the New York Times photo morgue before it came here. So, and it's a really good example of a lot of retouching and airbrushing on a photograph. So, put that back carefully. We also have a preparator in our department who helps us make these things, like these little, very special origami-like photo corners. And that's because one of the principles of how we store the collection is that we try to make everything as reversible as possible. So we try, whenever we do anything to a photograph, to allow it to be undone. We try not to hinge it whenever we can. We use photo corners instead. And so those are decisions that you can make with your own photographs. Like, if you put a lot of tape on the back of your picture, if you ever have to remove that tape, you are going to have problems. So keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to keep going. Oh, this is a super complicated question, but I really liked it. This is from Ken on YouTube, Ken Spencer. And he wrote, I have never understood the reasoning or logic behind the photographer Sherri Levine, who has made outright copies of the work of Walker Evans and then displays the prints as her own with a credit line like this, Sherri Levine, after Walker Evans. As a professional photographer all my life, this seems like an outright copyright violation. What am I not understanding here? So Ken, you are really getting to the heart of it. So let's dig in. We talked a little bit about forgeries. Hold on. Put this one safe. We talked a little bit about forgeries, and we talked about how you can make a Dorothea Lange picture yourself, which is not a forgery, just by downloading the file. But I thought what we'd do is actually show you a Sherri Levine. And MoMA doesn't own the series that you were talking about, Sherri Levine after Walker Evans, but we do own this after Rodchenko. So the after Walker Evans pictures were from like 1981. These were from a few years later, maybe 1987, I think. But it's really interesting when you get the opportunity to see them both up close and together. So I wonder if I can fit these both. I'm going to hold on to this one. Okay, so this is a Sherri Levine, and this is an Alexander Rodchenko. Now, if you look at the Rodchenko up close, I'm going to open the mat. It's a super delicate picture. This is a photograph of his mother, and you see the little inscription below. It's attached asymmetrically to this beautiful old mat. It's a beautiful, it's sort of a tender, poignant picture of his mother struggling to read, holding the glasses up to her eye. And then you look at it next to the Sherri Levine after Rodchenko. And there are a couple things you'll notice immediately. One is that it's reversed. So Sherri Levine is making her photographs from reproductions of those photographs. And she is not trying to make you think, well, she is and she isn't trying to make you think that it's a Rodchenko. She wants you to be able to recognize the image, but she's really poking at the question of like, what's an original and what's a copy? Have originals historically favored reputations of male artists where the idea of multiplicity, of lack of originality might be something new that she and artists of her generation in the 80s were exploring? And so she's not trying to imitate the tonality, and she often includes little cues that help you understand that what she's making isn't the same as the original, it's her version of it. So it is a really complex question, and it's one actually, there was an artist not that long ago who actually made copies of Sherri Levine's photographs. You can, I think if you Google it, you'll find it. Adding another layer to this idea of what's considered appropriation. And it is perfectly permissible to appropriate work in pursuit of making another work of art. And so these fall pretty squarely into that category, which is why they're okay. So, close it up. Oh, so excuse me, I'm sure I'm going to butcher this name. I'm sure I've butchered other ones earlier, apologies. But on YouTube, Chirag Wakaskar wrote, is there an effort by MoMA curators to have a more diverse group of photographers archived, by which I understand you mean in the collection? And yes, absolutely. We pursue this through a lot of different, and this is not just unique to my photography colleagues, these are my colleagues from all different departments. So we definitely want to have the collection represent the diversity of artistic production. And that means having photographers of different genders, of different races, from different places, from different times, because the idea is that how much more of an interesting reflection of not only our time, but of historical times, if we can understand a more diverse area of practice. So I'm actually going to Cuba tomorrow. We have these wonderful research groups at the museum that are called CMAP, Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives. And what those CMAP groups do is to try to help MoMA curators develop a deep familiarity with artistic practices that might be less well known in the US and in Western Europe, and to try and say, how can we really better understand what's happening in Latin America, in Asia, in Central and Eastern Europe, in Africa? And these are, partly why I feel so lucky to be a MoMA curator, is that one of our parts of our job is to try to develop that expertise, and we're given incredible tools to do that. So yes, diversity is an important thing for MoMA curators, and it's also an important thing all the way up to the director and our trustees. They're the ones who really make all of that research and study possible. Good question. Oh, okay. So Matt Spall wrote on YouTube, I've read that Man Ray made photograms without a camera. How was this done? Does MoMA have any examples in the collection? Oh, do we? So I'll put away this Rodchenko. We are so lucky that in 1941, a collector named James Thrall Sobey gave to the museum a group of photographs by Man Ray. Now, by the way, I was talking about how we store them before. This is a good example of when we're really, really, really being careful. So this one has not only Mylar, that's that, but it also has a sheet of what we call phototext, because these are super fragile, and a photogram means that it's unique. So take down the Mylar, remove the phototext. I'll leave this open like this. So yes, and I'm going to actually talk behind it, because God forbid I should spit on that photograph. So Man Ray, when he made these photograms, this is a unique contact print, which means that he took little glass stoppers from maybe crystal bottles and a little bit of gauze and a wire that he a little piece of wire that he put in a cube, and two other things that I can't quite figure out what they are, but he placed all of those things directly onto a piece of photographic paper, and then he turned on the light and then turned off the light. And in that exposure, anywhere where the light could get through to the paper, it became dark, and anywhere the light was blocked, it remained white. So this is something that's opaque. This is sort of semi-transparent, like the glass, and then the black was where the light shone straight through. So yes, the photograms actually are unique, and they are not made with a camera, which is partly why they're so precious and we want to take care of them. And thanks to James Thrall Sobey, when this group of pictures came to the collection in 1941, these were the pictures that were used as the plate, most of them, for the plates in a book that Man Ray published right around that time. Well, actually the book was from 32, actually 34, but anyway, it doesn't matter. They are really special things, and we feel very lucky to have them in the collection. Thank you, James Thrall Sobey. Moving on. Okay, so this is from Instagram, somebody whose name couldn't be this, but we'll answer it anyway. From Optimistic writes, please discuss in detail your preservation best practices and procedures. So we've been talking about that a little bit all day. Basically, the preservation is like, you want to be sure to have your hands clean. You want to be sure to try to have archival materials around the photographs whenever possible. You want to keep them as cold as possible and to not have your humidity fluctuate greatly. So that's what our collection storage does. It's an ongoing effort. If you're trying to do this at home, certainly not having your photographs in direct sunlight is a really good place to start. And then every other little step that you can do to preserve your photographs, we all want them to live a long time, whether it's a family photograph or something in MoMA's collection. So I hope that's detailed enough. It's probably not. But actually, we could do a whole other session. Maybe I should suggest this on photography conservation. Maybe because we have lots of great colleagues in conservation who can help us do that. Okay, well, this is a little similar. This is from Murray Hamilton, also on Instagram. Oh, I'm going to answer Murray's because it's actually related, and then I see there's a whole pile of other ones that a magic little birdie, namely our producer, brought to me. But Murray wrote, what are some restoration challenges with the photographs you have in your collection, and or what are the common restoration practices? So some of the challenges have to do with physical damage to the print, like cracking and things like that, edge damage. And to help address those, we definitely try to store them carefully. Our conservators can actually rework things, reinforce things pretty magically. You know, but the one thing that we really can't do is when like a color photograph fades, that's pretty much it. So that's why we try to store everything so cold and in collection storage. So it's, we're working on trying to share what we call our conservation practices, our storage practices more broadly, because the truth is we don't want to just hoard that information for ourselves. We want everyone to know it. So now I'm triply convinced that we should do a conservation session. This is a live question from Kathy Ann Lim on YouTube. And she wrote, what is the percentage of film versus digital prints collected by MoMA? It's a terrific question, and it's ever more important today. So I would say the thing you have to keep in mind is that digital prints didn't exist until, say, the last 20 years. So before then, every photograph we have before the mid-90s is not a digital print. So by the numbers, the percentage of digital prints is quite small. But if you look more recently, if we're just taking into account, let's say, the last 20 years, one of the interesting things that I found, especially in the last decade, is that you can't always tell. And that is because the technology has caught up to the point where whether you have a print from a film negative or a print from a film negative that has been scanned to become a digital file, or from a file that was actually born digital, captured digitally, all three of those things, well, the first one you can't make a digital print from that, but it might be virtually indistinguishable from the second and the third, which is the great part. So I guess partly what I would say is in more recent years, maybe if you can't tell, it doesn't matter as much. We're more concerned with what inks are you using, how should we store it, how should we preserve it. So still film wins out over digital, but just mainly because of the history. More and more and more current photographers are making prints either from scanned film negatives or from digital files. Interesting though. The world is changing. So sadly, this one means that we're reaching the end of our time. I really enjoyed your questions. I wish I could answer them all day, but everybody here has to go home. And if you're, I just want to tell you where some of the people have been tuning in from. We have people from Spain, Iran, Honduras, Colombia, Argentina, Germany, Hong Kong, you must be so tired, Bulgaria, Brazil, Serbia, San Francisco, Reno, Nevada, Columbus, Ohio, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Moscow, also must be tired, Croatia, and the Ukraine. That's so terrific. I love seeing how many people tuned in from all over the world. So we hope you enjoyed this. If you did, sorry, there are a few things I'm supposed to remember to say as we wrap this up. There are other live Q&A sessions on MoMA's YouTube channel. Check them all out. They're all really terrific. I learned a lot through them. You can also look through, we have a special photography playlist, which includes a lot of the videos that we made for an online course called Seeing Through Photographs on Coursera. And to those of you who are our Coursera learners, thank you for taking the course. Your enthusiasm means so much to us, and we'll keep doing these activations. There'll be a link to the Seeing Through Photographs in Coursera, if you, in the comments thing if you want to do that. And if we didn't get to your question, I know I have a stack here. I know there were others that came in. First, I'm sorry. We're doing our best. I was trying to rip through them. But we'll also try to continue answering them in the coming days. So thanks for tuning in. Keep sending us questions. Let us know if you want to see more of these live Q&As and what you'd like them to be about. And also, most important, subscribe to MoMA's YouTube channel so you don't miss another one. Thanks a lot. Yay.